Matthew, you have real tattoos, right?
Yeah.
Now, are the tattoos? Are there actor tattoos that play your tattoos on the show, or are those?
No, we don't add any. We just use the ones that I've already that I got, throughout my life, and I thought that was a really cool choice on Damon and JJ's part early on to leave tattoos on a guy that you wouldn't normally think would be tattooed. I mean, a spinal surgeon, somebody with that kind of background. I think it was just a choice that was cool that you'd obviously want to know why a guy like that ended up being tattooed and what it meant to him, what they specifically meant to him.
They mean something other than what the tattoos really mean to you?
Yeah, we never discussed what they mean to me. I don't really ever tell anybody what they mean to me, but that they could take the visual aspects of what I've put on and make up their own stories behind those tattoos.
Okay. And your tattoo, are they any? I don't remember what your tattoo designs or numbers or.
There's a lot of different stuff. I mean,
Hello Kitty.
We're gonna get into this conversation.
Take off your clothes for a second.
No.
Settle down.
This is for the Academy. All right, let's see what else we have here. You answered that. Beard hair, you answered that. Okay, if the others have contact with the outside world, which we saw the Red Sox game, why couldn't a surgeon be flown into the island for Ben?
Because then they wouldn't need Jack. Right. Isn't it obvious?
Perhaps he was.
That's an excellent question, and one that we will actually be answering within sort of the next 6 or 7 episodes once we come back in February 7th. Certainly the others do or did have the ability to leave the island. Whether they still have that ability is yet to be determined, but there is a very specific reason that they did not bring an outside surgeon to the island or bring Ben off the island.
There's a reason why they didn't bring a surgeon to the island.
Yes.
What is it?
It has something to do with HMOs and.
It has to do with the foot.
Yeah.
It does. Does it really?
No.
Oh. That's why they didn't bring a podiatrist to the island, right? If Jack had indeed died at the end of the pilot, like you guys have said, that was the original plan, who would be the main protagonist of the show? Which character?
Well, we actually wrote that script. We wrote a draft of the show. The original outline, had Jack dying about halfway through, and then Kate emerged as she is very traumatized. Basically, Jack was what ended up being Greg Grunberg. He gets killed by the monster and gets thrown up into a tree, and he has the transceiver sticking out of the back of his pocket, and Kate has to go climbing up the tree and get the transceiver back, and she comes back into camp, and Saeed and Sawyer are having their fight, and she gives this sort of big, terribly emotive, sort of on-the-nose speech about what it ended up being the Live Together, Die Alone speech 4 episodes later in the show. It was all about like, hey, look, we have to stop infighting. We've only been here for a couple hours, for a day now at this point. So it was Kate, and that was the scene that Evangeline actually had to read when she first came down, and she was like, I came down from Canada for this? It was, but the show was so much in flux, and this was one of the things, ABC was, they were sort of undergoing a changing of the guard at the time, and Steve McPherson, who was at Touchstone, was about to become the president of ABC. His one big note upon reading the pilot was, "You can't kill Jack." This was before we met Matthew or anybody else. By the time Matthew came in, we had rewritten the script so that Jack did survive. And we basically looked at each other and said, we're hearing this note now from enough people. I think JJ's wife Katie was also was sort of echoing that sentiment. And we always loved the idea because it was like Janet Leigh in Psycho. It was like, hey, you kill the main dude, the audience will think anything can happen. But what we never took into account was it works in Psycho, because Psycho's a movie, but if you do it in a TV show, the audience will never trust you again. Every character you ask them to invest in, they will basically say, well, I invested in that guy. He was saving all these people, and I really liked him, and he was sensitive, and and then you had him get killed by the monster. I can't bond with the show because, you're making death arbitrary in that fashion. So, we backed off it because it was the right move.
I remember when Greg Grunberg read the script, and he's a friend of mine since kindergarten. He was in Felicity and Alias, and he read the script, and he was mad at us because he loved Jack, and he thought Jack died. He felt like it was an affront. So
we were like, we'll kill you.
That's right, we killed him. Yeah. So I was like, which precludes him from being on the show, but now he's on Heroes, so that's okay.
On an aside note that has nothing to do with anything we've been talking about, I just need to say that actors are human beings, and I've been squirming in my seat for half an hour because I really have to go to the bathroom. So I'm going to excuse myself for a minute because I don't want to embarrass myself in front of a room of a lot of people and prove how human we all are, and I'll be right back.
Evangeline Lilly, ladies and gentlemen. Evangeline Lilly.
Going to pee.
Can I just say one thing, which is that writers are also human beings? Thank you.
We just go in our pants.
I think we know who's going to get the next DUI. Speaking of Heroes, and Greg is on Heroes, there's some tie between the show Lost and the show Heroes. And what is that? What is the tie exactly between the show, besides the fact that you guys are buddies? And will that continue? I mean, will there be more bleed over?
Tim Kring and I, Tim gave me a job on this show, Crossing Jordan, which he was running at the time and still executive produces. And I worked there for 3 seasons. And during that time, the first year that Crossing Jordan was on, that was the year that Alias started. And in fact, Jill Hennessy and Jen Garner and Kim Delaney, who was in the show called Philly, were like on the cover of TV Guide, and so I became a huge Alias fan out of the gate, and Tim watched it as well, and we would always sort of talk about it, and I was sort of a big JJ fan. So when the opportunity sort of arose within the 3rd season of Crossing Jordan, in fact, it was 3 years ago next week that I first met with you guys. I said, we're finishing up, can I go write this pilot with JJ? It would be a dream come true. And Tim said, absolutely, go with God, Vai con Dios. I still had a year on my deal there, and he was totally cool. And then, and I was like, the good news is this thing is never going to go. It's, it's the worst idea ever. The budget is ridiculous. It's going to be a disaster of unmitigated proportions. So I'll be back. And lo and behold, sort of Lost happened, and there's this sort of like beautiful, circularity to it because, Tim had long sort of had this idea of kind of wanting to do, Unbreakable the series, this idea of like people who had superpowers, normal everyday people, and that would have a huge cast and it would be too expensive to do as a television show. But then, he sort of later commented because of Lost, he could walk into NBC and say, I'm now pitching this show, Heroes, it could work. And, and lo and behold, here we are a year later, and, they're nominated for a Globe against us, and they've got all this heat, and Grunberg's on the show, and, Tim and I are still really tight, and Evie's back, and everybody stared at her. And so, and sort of the karmic, balance of things, it's been pretty cool.
And will there be more of that, and will that increase as the seasons of both shows go on?
You mean actual story?
Yeah, and isn't the Hanso Foundation or there's some tie there?
There haven't been any formal talks about actually sort of bonding up formally bonding up the shows. Mm-hmm. They've sort of approached us, and we've sort of approached them jokingly, hey, it would be fun to have, Hiro, the Japanese time bender, pop onto the island because, you could get away with that because he can sort of move into other dimensions and the shows can sort of live in that same space. But at the same time, when you actually talk about doing it, I think everybody who watches Lost would go, they're definitely fucking making it up as they go along. Because this show didn't even exist when they came up with the original plan.
And what makes you think we don't think that now anyway?